Hello and welcome to IFRS Talks, your source for all things IFRS. I'm your host, Anu Pandya. In this episode, we'll be covering sustainability reporting developments from the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, and the latest updates on the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS. We will also discuss a few updates to the guidance in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, known as the GHG Protocol. Joining me to discuss all of this is Katie de Keyser, a director in PwC's Global Corporate Reporting Services team, specializing in sustainability reporting. Katie, thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Anu.
Now, Katie, the last time we spoke about sustainability on the podcast was in July of last year. We focused then on the proposed amendments to IFRS S2, which is the climate standard, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, enhancement project. And we also spoke about the biodiversity research project that the ISSB is working on. Could you share what the ISSB has been busy with since the last time we spoke?
Yeah, of course, Anu. So the ISSB has been really focused on helping companies implement IFRS S1 and IFRS S2, so the two sustainability disclosure standards. And that implementation work, that's continued steadily since the last time we spoke on this podcast. One of the more significant areas of feedback that the ISSB has been receiving from stakeholders in relation to IFRS S1 and S2 really relates to application challenges that some stakeholders are facing related to the greenhouse gas emissions disclosure requirements, particularly related to financed emissions. Now, I know in the previous podcast, when we last spoke, we talked about an exposure draft that the ISSB had issued back in April on the proposed amendments to the GHG emissions disclosures. So since then, the ISSB has actually issued and finalized that set of amendments. So we've got 4 new targeted amendments to IFRS S2. And the aim of those amendments was really to provide some clarity on existing requirements and some reliefs related to specific GHG emission disclosure requirements in IFRS S2.
Thanks, Katie. So from my high-level understanding of the amendments, I understand that 2 of these relate to financed emissions. Could you please remind our listeners what financed emissions refers to before we get into the details of the amendments?
Sure, of course. So financed emissions are a subset of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And for those of our listeners who maybe haven't heard that term before, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions are essentially indirect emissions that are a consequence of the activities of the reporting entity, but which occur at sources that reporting entity doesn't own or control. And so financed emissions are those Scope 3 emissions that are associated with a reporting entity's investments that are not already included as part of its other GHG emission disclosures, it's Scope 1 or Scope 2. So within that category, financed emissions, you might see emissions associated with things like a company's lending or its investments or other kind of financing or insurance type activities.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so let's get into what these 2 amendments actually cover. Could you please take us through what these amendments are looking at?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned we have 4 targeted amendments, and 2 of those relate to financed emissions. So of those 2, the first amendment gives entities the option to limit the measurement and disclosure of Category 15 Scope 3 emissions to just financed emissions. In other words, entities don't need to include emissions from derivatives or other types of financial activities in that Category 15 disclosure within their IFRS S2 reporting. This amendment is framed as sort of a relief, so an entity is allowed to, but is not required to exercise this relief. And if it does use this relief to limit its disclosure to just financed emissions, then there are some additional disclosures that also need to be provided to describe how the entity has applied that relief. So that's the first of the 2 amendments that are sort of connected to financed emissions. The second one relates to the disaggregation of those financed emissions, specifically for entities in either commercial banking or insurance sectors. Previously, IFRS S2 required entities to use a specific classification standard to disaggregate these emissions, the global industry classification standard. And the amendment here introduces some flexibility, allowing entities to choose an industry classification system to do this disaggregation, provided that there's some explanation about what they've used and clear reasons behind the system that they've selected.
Okay, perfect. Now, I also understand that the other two amendments are a little bit broader than that. So could you give us a brief overview of what those other two relate to?
Sure. So the other two amendments, they both relate to what's known as the jurisdictional relief. So IFRS S2 requires an entity to use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard to measure its greenhouse gas emissions. However, there is a jurisdictional relief within the standard that says that if an entity is required by its jurisdictional authority or a stock exchange on which it is listed to use a different approach to measure its greenhouse gas emissions, then it can use that different approach in its IFRS S2 disclosures. So what this amendment does is it clarifies that jurisdictional relief and essentially says that if a part of an entity, so let's say a subsidiary, is required to use a different method other than the GHG protocol, then that part of the entity can still use that other method in its IFRS S2 disclosures. And the final amendment provides some clarity on the use of, again, this jurisdictional relief as it relates to global warming potential values. So global warming potential values are essentially the factors that are used to convert different greenhouse gases into a CO2 or carbon dioxide equivalent measure. And essentially, the amendment to IFRS S2 allows an entity to use the GWP values, the global warming potential values, that its jurisdictional authority or an exchange on which it is listed requires it to use. So those are both sort of providing a little bit more relief, a little bit more flexibility in terms of what an entity is required to do in its IFRS S2 reporting when it's also subject to some jurisdictional requirements. And all four of those amendments, so the amendments that are specific to financed emissions and also the amendments related to the jurisdictional relief, all four of those are effective for reporting periods beginning on or after 1st of January 2027. Early application ahead of 1 Jan 2027 is permitted, so an entity is allowed to early adopt if they wish to.
Perfect. Thanks, Katie. 2027 will be here sooner than we think, so I think entities really need to start thinking about what effects these amendments will have on their reporting. So thank you so much for all those updates. All right, so if you can then stay on the ISSB updates for now, but if we can move on to developments for the biodiversity research project. Can you tell us what's happening there? I remember from our last discussion in July that this project is called the Bees, which I found quite amusing. So could you tell us a little bit more about this project?
Yeah, sure. And you remembered correctly. It is colloquially referred to as the BEES project, standing for Biodiversity, Ecosystems, and Ecosystem Services, which is quite a mouthful. So we tend to call it BEES for short. So the BEES project, it started as a research project where the ISSB was looking into investor needs in relation to information about nature-related matters, so nature-related risks and opportunities. And in that research project, the ISSB staff was also looking at some of the other existing standards and frameworks out there related to nature, especially the TNFD, so the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Now, they were working on that research project for a while, and after they sort of concluded the research project, the ISSB board decided in December 2025, so just a couple months ago, the board decided to move that BEES project into the next phase, so into a standard setting phase. And actually, even though we're only in February, the ISSB has already made a couple of important decisions this year in relation to the BEES project. So first, they had a meeting where they confirmed that the scope for this standard setting project should cover all nature-related risks and opportunities. So when we talk about BEES, we're talking specifically about biodiversity and ecosystems, but the board decided that in the standard setting project, they should be considering all nature-related risks and opportunities, including biodiversity, ecosystems, water, pollution, land use, essentially the sort of full range of nature-related issues that could affect an entity's prospects. And secondly, the board also decided that any future nature standard should be incremental to IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. So that is to say, it should build on the sort of same core architecture rather than setting up like a completely different system of reporting. So we get that kind of consistency across the existing standards and this future project. Another big part of the conversation in the most recent board meeting at the ISSB about this project was about the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So the TNFD framework is a framework that a lot of companies are already using on a voluntary basis to report investor-relevant information about nature-related risks and opportunities. And so the ISSB intends to draw on that work on TNFD, focusing and staying anchored in that investor-focused lens. So information that is material about an entity's nature-related risks or opportunities. And so we're kind of at like the start of this project, and it will be interesting to see where we go from here.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess with all of these decisions that have now been made, like you said, on scope, alignment, and some technical building blocks, what could we expect coming in the future months as things develop?
Yeah, so while the kind of beginning of the direction here is clear, there's still a lot of important work to do ahead as the ISSB shapes, their kind of thinking on this topic. So the ISSB board has asked the staff to go and do some more analysis and bring back some more papers on a few different areas. For example, some of those areas that the staff is looking at include how climate disclosures, so disclosures under IFRS S2, and nature disclosures might interact, maybe how to approach disclosures on any transition plans an entity has related to nature, and how the standard setting project should approach metrics. So what kinds of metrics, or should there be sort of cross industry metrics related to nature? So those are some of the areas the staff are looking at. So we expect, over the coming months, the ISSB to continue refining some of these more complex issues. One of the other things that the board has also talked about is continuing to assess interoperability as this project progresses. So we know, for example, that GRI and ESRS both have standards related to nature. And so the ISSB is also keeping an eye on making sure that, there's interoperability built into the start of this standard setting project. So while we're seeing like the first steps here, we are going to see ongoing technical development as the ISSB builds towards an exposure draft, which is kind of the planned outcome of this standard setting project. And I think that's planned for sort of the second half of 2026. So I'd recommend that our listeners keep an eye and an ear on this topic to see how things progress.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Katie. So we spent some time now talking about climate-related disclosures under IFRS S2, but I've also heard that there's been some development at the GHG Protocol that could affect how entities calculate and report their greenhouse gas emissions. So if you could turn now to the GHG Protocol, could you tell us a little bit more about what these recent changes have been and how they might potentially impact the listeners?
Yeah, sure. I might actually pause and just take a little bit of a step back first to kind of remind our listeners sort of what the GHG protocol is, why we're talking about this on an IFRS Talks podcast. The GHG protocol, it continues to be a very widely used framework for companies reporting greenhouse gases. It also underpins a lot of regulatory and other standard setting or other standard setter requirements. So the ISSB standards, as we've already talked about, refer to the GHG protocol. ESRS refers to the GHG protocol. And even some of the GHG reporting regulations that we're seeing coming out of California also refer to the GHG protocol, all telling companies to use that protocol to measure their greenhouse gas emissions. So basically, any updates to the protocol might ultimately influence how companies measure the GHG information that ends up in their ISSB reporting, for example. So the GHG protocol, they have a pretty large work plan underway right now to revise and reconsider a lot of its guidance. And recently, as part of this work plan, they issued a public consultation around the Scope 2 guidance. So that's the part of the GHG protocol that talks about how companies should measure emissions from purchased electricity, heating, cooling, and steam. And so the GHG protocol wanted to sort of update Scope 2 reporting to reflect how electricity markets have changed. And the protocol is so currently still proposing to keep the dual reporting approach that we have in Scope 2, which sort of allows for both location-based reporting and market-based reporting, but to update the rules around the market-based method to try to more accurately reflect what's happening at a grid level, at like the electricity grid level. I won't go into all the technical details here. We would be here for a long time if we went through everything that's included in this consultation. But I will say that we at PwC, we've submitted a response outlining our support for the need to update this Scope 2 guidance, as well as some recommendations around some of the proposals.
Okay, and what are the next steps? So how does the process move going forwards?
Yeah, so the GHG protocol will now review the feedback that they've received and consider revisions to their proposals for the Scope 2 standard. And as I said, this is sort of one part of the GHG protocol's work plan. So it's one part of a multi-year project. So we can expect to see further consultations as this work continues. So change is coming, but not happening right now. So companies do still have time to follow the process and prepare and respond to some of these consultations.
Perfect. So you mentioned the ESRS just now when you were talking about the GHG protocol. I've also heard that there's been a lot of changes recently in the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Now, this is an IFRS podcast, but a lot of our listeners are interested in ESRS because, of course, many companies around the world will have to report using these standards if they have, large operations in the European Union. Would you be able to give our listeners some insight into what is actually happening to ESRS at the moment?
Yeah, sure, Andrew. There have been a lot of developments in sustainability reporting in the EU, focusing specifically on ESRS. So back in March of last year, the European Commission asked EFRAG to essentially propose some simplifications to the ESRS, to the standards. And EFRAG delivered technical advice to the Commission with these simplifications in December of 2025, so just a couple of months ago.
Okay, well, that sounds like a pretty big standard-setting task. So what did they eventually deliver as part of that technical advice?
Yeah, so the technical advice essentially contains an entire set of revised ESRS. So it has revisions to all 12 ESRS standards, so the 2 cross-cutting standards and the 10 topical standards. The technical advice also contains updates for the annexes around definitions of terms and acronyms. And EFRAG also delivered a marked up version showing changes between kind of the original and the revised ESRSs.
Okay, and are there significant changes between the current ESRS being applied and the revised ESRS?
Yes, there's quite a lot of change. We probably don't have time today to go through everything that has changed, but the revised ESRS, they're significantly shorter. There's been some pretty significant changes to the structure of what the standards look like when you open them. Some of the significant areas of change to the content of the ESRS include things like the concept of fair presentation, which is now much more explicit in the standards. There's a lot of new guidance on how to apply the double materiality principle. There's a lot of updates to different disclosure requirements, including the disclosure requirements around anticipated financial effects of risks and opportunities. There's new reporting reliefs. There's a lot of changes at both the cross-cutting level and at the topical level.
Okay, well, let's unpack some of those significant areas of change for our listeners. So firstly, you mentioned fair presentation. Now, that's a concept that many will be familiar with from the financial reporting world. It's a concept that we've heard before. So could you expand on what EFRAG did in relation to fair presentation?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, one of the key changes in the revised ESRS is this emphasis on the fact that ESRS are a fair presentation framework. And it's introduced up front in ESRS 1 as a sort of fundamental basis of the standards, clarifying that the objective of the ESRS is to fairly present information about an entity's material sustainability related impacts, risks, and opportunities. And that kind of fair presentation concept, that would include not only complying with the disclosure requirements of the standards, but also providing material entity specific information when applying the ESRS by themselves is not sufficient for users to understand an entity's material impacts, risks, and opportunities.
You also mentioned some new guidance on double materiality. Could you please expand a bit more on what this new guidance looks like?
Yeah, so the double materiality principle, it remains sort of fundamental to the ESRS. As a quick reminder to our listeners, double materiality, that's just the term used to describe the assessment of both an entity's sustainability related impacts as well as its sustainability related risks and opportunities. So EFRAG was asked by the European Commission to develop kind of additional guidance around double materiality. And the updates that we're seeing in revised ESRS have sort of two aspects to them. So first, we're seeing a lot of additional guidance related to the actual double materiality assessment itself. So how an entity identifies its impacts, risks, and opportunities. And we also see a lot of revisions to the guidance around materiality of information. So if we think about the double materiality assessment, the new guidance, it retains the concept of identifying impacts, risks, and opportunities, but provides some new provisions, new guidance with the intention to streamline that process of identifying the impacts, risks, and opportunities. So some of the new guidance in ESRS 1 talks about the fact that a company is not required to assess every possible IRO across its operations and value chains. It gives some options for an entity to do what's known as a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. So identifying IROs based on an analysis of the entity's strategy and business model, rather than doing like an impact by impact assessment. There's also some new guidance in there around what kinds of things qualify as positive impacts, and specific guidance on how to consider an entity's own actions when assessing the materiality of impacts. So how does a company think about mitigation, remediation, or prevention actions when it's looking at its impacts? The other main change in this area, as I mentioned earlier, is around the materiality of information. So under current ESRS, so the ESRS that people are applying today, there were some data points that had to be disclosed regardless of materiality. Under revised ESRS, entities are only required to disclose information that is material, and that filter is applied to all information, even information that is sort of prescribed by a disclosure requirement.
Okay, that's really helpful. Now, Katie, you also mentioned reporting reliefs as one of the significant changes. So what do these reliefs actually cover?
Yeah, so revised ESRS introduces quite a few new reporting reliefs to help really facilitate the application of the standard. We probably don't have time today to go into all of the detail of these reliefs, but I would say some of the main ones that our listeners might be interested to go and take a look at include some reliefs related to business combinations, so how an entity treats acquisitions and disposals when it's identifying impacts, risks, and opportunities. And there's also some new reliefs around calculation of metrics, so what an entity needs to do when it's disclosing metrics related to its impacts, risks, and opportunities.
So what can we expect as the next steps for these revised ESRS standards?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the revised ESRS that we've been talking about today, these are part of a piece of technical advice that EFRAG has provided to the European Commission. So right now, the European Commission is reviewing that advice, and it may choose to make some updates or changes before ultimately adopting the revised ESRS as a delegated act. We expect the Commission will first issue a draft version of that delegated act, so essentially a draft version of the revised ESRS before they published that final version. And we currently expect that final version of the delegated act to be published around the middle of 2026. That delegated act as well as containing the final revised ESRS, will also establish the effective date for those standards. So I would really suggest that our listeners, keep an eye on the Commission's progress over the coming months to stay up to date with any changes that might be put in place between the technical advice, which we just talked about, and this final delegated act.
Okay, so lots coming up on the horizon. Perfect. So thank you so much, Katie. I think that covers all that we wanted to talk about today. So thank you for joining me, and thank you for all of the insights that you've provided us on the world of sustainability reporting. Thank you as well to our listeners for tuning in. We have several resources that are linked to the topics discussed today. You can refer to our in-brief on IFRS S2 and GHG Protocol amendments, and our in-depth on the revisions to ESRS. We'll add all the links to this published guidance in the episode description. Since we discussed a number of developments that are still in progress, we will continue to issue guidance as the ISSB's projects and the ESRS revisions evolve. To never miss an episode, remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, happy accounting and reporting.
This podcast has been brought to you by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP. This content is for general information purposes and is not a substitution for consultation with professional advisors.